Welcome to tonight's Terror, where you can expect original scary stories. Nothing here is written or narrated by AI. If you enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for visiting, and enjoy the story.
I'm an environmental engineer. I work in complete solitude most of the time. That's the way I like it. I'll be on assignment in rural Montana for weeks or even months at a time and not see a soul. There have been a few times over the years that this started to get to me, but those moments were the exception. The peace, the natural beauty, the wildlife, it can't be beat. Recently, I hiked 60 miles through somewhat rough terrain to make sure a gate was open. That was the job. I know it sounds crazy, but some of these places are so inaccessible that paying me to hike there is cheaper than the helicopter fuel, I guess. To be honest, I wouldn't have it any other way. The things I've been lucky enough to witness as I've walked the American West are tough to put into words. I usually feel very lucky to do this job. Most of my duties are simple, but time-consuming. Often I have to cover a lot of miles to even reach the destination, but once I do, the actual work might take a matter of minutes. On the way, I get to camp, stargaze, read, really anything I might get up to. The chances of me running into someone feel astronomical. A coworker had warned me that while rare, it did happen. She said she'd been on a week-long assignment, taking her down the shore of a section of the Yellowstone River. She was convinced that someone had been stalking her. Gates she knew she'd closed would be open. Odd whistling sounds from nearby in the brush, she said. It all culminated with her leaving her tent one morning to find a stack of stones piled a few feet in front of her tent. The top stone had a crudely drawn smiley face scratched on it with the soot from her fire pit. Almost a decade ago, when I was still relatively green, I received an assignment that required I hike out and camp overnight to reach a remote region where soil contamination was a concern. I needed to take samples from local water sources. Although I wouldn't do the actual testing, I'm sure the idea was to make sure that a controversial pipeline in the area wasn't impacting natural bodies of water. The hike there had been uneventful. I'd heard reports of a moose in the region, and I was disappointed when I didn't come across one. The weather had been getting colder, and the wind grew nastier as the afternoon wore on. I've never been bothered by frigid temperatures, but on really long days, the wind can make me question my career choices. I was going to have to draw water samples from 5 different locations. I was hoping to knock one out today before the sun got too low. My rule was always that my tent would be up before the sun disappeared completely. This time of year, if I didn't have my tent up by dark, the temperature would drop so fast that making camp would be miserable. Whenever I flirted with the idea of breaking my rule, I'd think of that Jack London story, To Build a Fire. I wasn't going to be caught losing feeling in my fingers and dying beside a pile of spent matches. Dramatic? Absolutely. But the notion kept me honest. I decided to make camp near the first collection site, a culvert, basically a big open drainage pipe, beneath a service road, probably originally built for loggers. The road didn't even connect to highways anymore. I don't think it had seen a car or truck in decades. I could see the dark semicircle of the tunnel ahead of me as I covered the last quarter mile or so. My stomach was groaning with hunger. All I could think about was making something to eat and getting off my feet. As I approached, I began to feel ill at ease. It happened from time to time, when I'd feel the need to pause and take a look around, just to make sure I was entirely alone. Sometimes in the summer, I'd become convinced I heard a rattlesnake nearby. Today, however, I hadn't heard anything. I just felt unsettled. Once the crunch of my boots ceased, the only sound was a distant creak of metal settling into frost. The culvert pipe, I thought. This was my third assignment this year, surveying this stretch or that of Montana's wilderness for soil redemption potential. Completely alone, but for the occasional elk in the distance, or the rare hawk pulling across the sky. I slowly turned, seeing empty horizon in every direction, except ahead at my 2 o'clock. There was a small rise in the earth, covered in the wheatgrass I saw everywhere I looked in this region. But something was poking out above the swaying tufts of grass. It looked a bit like antlers. My heart leapt. Was it a moose? No, the rack was too small. If I was right and those were antlers, I couldn't understand how they were positioned. It was hard to make out against the dying sunlight beyond, but they must have been elevated 8 or 10 feet above the grass. I decided to quit gawking and carry on. Watching my steps to avoid prairie dog holes, I could only look up every few paces. A turned or broken ankle out here would be a nightmare. As I closed on the rise and my potential campsite, the antlers appeared lower than I'd originally thought. I assumed I'd been looking at an elk and it dipped its head. It was odd, though, that it hadn't run off with the sound of my approach. Then, a few paces more, and the antlers were entirely gone. But how had they been so high before? I shook off the thought and focused on what mattered. I'd arrived. The best thing to do was set up camp on the leeward side of the rise. The culvert from which I'd be drawing water for testing cut through this same little hillock, so that work would be easily accessible once I was ready. Pitching my tent and unloading my gear was automatic at this point. I had everything looking organized within a few minutes. As I sat, loosening the laces on my boots, I looked into the dark opening of the culvert. The deep black stood out against the earthy tones of the grass surrounding it and the copper-colored sky above. It reminded me of an infamous landmark in my hometown, a culvert running under a remote section of road. Rumors among the older kids told that a young girl was murdered in that pipe, and the body hadn't been found for nearly a year. One senior at my school had tried to convince me that the whole town had been drinking her up in their water all those months. I stopped untying my boots and stood. Something was pulling me toward the culvert. I wanted to see, just a bit farther inside. I told myself I wanted to get a look at the water level. It would be a wasted trip out here if there was no water to sample. In truth, the instinct to draw closer felt very opposite to reason, logic, even self-preservation. The pull I felt was more like seeing one unbroken window in an old factory while holding a nice round rock in your hand. I stepped toward the culvert, flashlight in hand. Once I drew water samples, I had special instructions to inspect the pipe itself, degraded by age and rusted by decades of unchecked runoff. The water trickling out smelled faintly metallic, a hint of something acrid carried on the current. The afternoon had already stretched thin. Orange and violet touches dabbed the horizon as the dusk settled in. As I crouched by the culvert, an unexpected sound made me flinch back. At first I dismissed it as the wind pulling into the opening. Soft, fragmented murmurs that seemed to curl around the entrance. I adjusted my stance, leaning in closer to the echoing mouth of the pipe. It really didn't sound like the wind. There was a cadence to it, like words spoken by someone just out of earshot. I swallowed hard and clicked on the flashlight. The beam cut into the black depth of the pipe, revealing its slimy walls and a shallow stream leading into the dark. The sound rose again, unmistakably speech-like, though no words reached me. Just wispy syllables dissolving into each other, punctuated by an occasional pause. "Hello?" I called, my voice rough and unused after a day without speaking. It bounced back at me flat and small. Nothing answered, but the murmuring sounds quickly stopped. I stood, frozen, straining to hear anything above the thrum of my pulse. The silence stretched out. And then came a different sound. Water, shifting. Somewhere deep inside. A minute splash, as if someone or something moved, just out of sight. Logic kept my feet planted. Perhaps a hiker had taken shelter in the pipe, or an animal had wandered in. But there was a sense, unwelcome and insistent, that the sound hadn't come from any source I could explain. I leaned closer to the edge, the beam of my flashlight trembling along the ridged interior. The murmurs resumed, louder this time with a sharper tone. They didn't sound quite right, like someone trying to mimic speech without understanding it. The air around the culvert felt colder than before, almost damp. A strange metallic scent filled my nostrils and my flashlight began to flicker. "Damn it," I muttered, stepping back and smacking the base of the flashlight against my palm. I paced rapidly away, half sidestepping to keep an eye on the opening. I'd been spooked this way a few times over the years. Rocks falling nearby in a canyon, seeing the same hiker a few too many times. Odd sounds outside the tent at night. Each time, I ended up annoyed with myself in the aftermath, chasing shadows and losing sleep over nothing. Obviously, there was no one out here. The wind could do funny things on the prairie. I was certain it could make stranger sounds yet with a metal tunnel to play with. The splashing could have been anything. The opening was 8 feet high. The elk might have wandered in. Thinking again on those antlers, I wished I hadn't. How were they up so high? It was like they'd been at the top of a totem pole. Even if somehow a set of elk antlers had ended up on a heap of rocks above the rest of the hill, where had they gone? I did not like this place. Originally, I'd planned to camp here and strike out daily for some of the other collection sites, and then return each night. I wasn't planning on that anymore. I resolved to make it through the night and move to a different base camp in the morning. I'd collect the water here first thing, and then make tracks. My unease had settled deep, coiled in my gut. Dinner tasted like nothing. Every bit of dehydrated stew felt like chewing through wads of newspaper. The quiet around me had grown more oppressive. I could hear every shift of my clothing, every scrape of fabric against my gear. I tried to keep still to hear things beyond my camp. The culvert sat like a wound at the edge of my vision, a yawning black hole my mind couldn't stop orbiting. I avoided looking at it, but I felt its presence just the same, like a stare pressing into my back. I heard no more of the uncanny murmuring from the dark. Once, while staring into the dim glow of the camping stove, I thought I heard a sound, like someone tapping on the metal of the culvert. My hand froze, the fork suspended inches from my lips, that ting sound fading before I could turn my head and focus. It had come from the direction of the culvert. The sound didn't repeat. An animal? Maybe the metal of the tunnel shifting as the temperature dropped? The wind? That explanation felt increasingly hollow. I crawled into my tent well before I was tired. It was a flimsy shield, but at least the fabric blocked my view of the culvert. I zipped the entrance tight, clicked off my headlamp, and buried myself in my sleeping bag. The cold crept in, no matter how tightly I cocooned myself. I fell asleep faster than I'd expected. The hike had exhausted me, and the physical need for rest won out over the anxiety this place draped over me. I slept fitfully, though. In a dream, or at least I think it was a dream, I lay in my sleeping bag. Suddenly, a figure was perched heavily on my chest, staring down at my sleeping face. I couldn't make out a face, but the thing was lanky and crouched like a gargoyle. I could feel tremendous weight pushing the air out of my lungs. I tried to flail my way out of the dream, but my arms felt like they were wrapped in soaking blankets. I couldn't move an inch. In the dream, I made a tremendous effort and opened my eyes. I looked up to see the silhouetted figure of a grotesquely formed creature. Its enormous, dark eyes bore into me, but all I could focus on was the imposing rack of antlers bursting obscenely from the crown of its head. I choked awake, finally breaking free from the dream. In the instant before I opened my eyes, for real this time, I swear I felt something press down on my chest as if heaving itself up and off of me. But the tent was empty. When I looked down and toward the door, I saw only the points of my feet at the bottom of my sleeping bag. I lay awake for a long time. Over the next few hours, I made a few ill-fated attempts at sleep. Ultimately, I gave up. The gray light of morning was beginning to press through the thin fabric of the tent wall. There was no point in delaying. I'd get up, make coffee, collect the water, and go. Once I was dressed and had my boots tied, I unzipped the tent door, the sound loud against the stillness of the morning. No matter how many nights I spent in a tent, I'll never exit one gracefully. I stumbled up and out, my back and knees protesting. Standing, I surveyed the space. Nothing appeared to have been disturbed in the night. It was still scarcely dawn, so the light was weak. I took a few tentative steps toward the culvert, scanning the earth for animal prints. It was a habit I'd developed over the years whenever I'd wake up or return to my campsite after an absence. Seeing nothing, I opened my case and began organizing my sample collection kit. As I worked, something in my peripheral vision made me turn and look more closely at the tunnel's opening. Antlers, sticking up from the ground like some pagan ornament, directly in front of the entrance. They weren't attached to a skull, just planted upright in the earth, their tips gleaming wetly in the cold light of morning. Who was out here? I thought, feeling as vulnerable as I'd been in my dream. Was I still asleep? I stood abruptly and instinctively balled my hands into fists. The antlers may have been there for hours, but I felt like someone had just placed them there and was about to pounce. I needed to get out of here. I had bear spray, but nothing else to defend myself if I was attacked. It was in my pack. After a long moment, I took a cautious step toward the tent. The instant I moved, a noise erupted from the pipe. A high, keening wail that seemed to claw its way up through the tunnel. I stumbled backward, dropping the sample kit as the sound cut through me. It didn't sound human, and it wasn't any animal I'd ever heard. It was something else entirely, something out of place in my version of this Montana universe. I fumbled to open my pack as it slumped awkwardly against the side of the tent. I seized the can of bear spray, but in my haste fumbled it. It fell with a clatter. The can rolled across the ground, close to the antlers. My eyes darted to the pipe. Movement. A fleeting, rippling shift inside. My instincts implored me to leave, but my legs hesitated, rooted by a perverse compulsion to understand what I'd heard. I crouched and retrieved the bear spray, now steady, and pointed it back into the culvert. The murmurs stopped again, leaving only the sound of water trickling. I squinted into the darkened void. My eyes strained, and slowly I began to discern a shape in the dark. It wasn't an animal. Not in the way I understood animals, at least. The figure was bipedal, but bent double and wrong in its proportions, perhaps to fit in the culvert pipe, its outline warped by the dim light and the curvature of the walls. Something like a head tilted, the enormous antlers clearer now as the thing moved. The weak rays of light reaching the thing glinted where eyes should have been, but they didn't reflect light like the eyes of wildlife. They absorbed it, leaving hollow spaces where my gaze found them. I knew those eyes. This thing had been in my tent last night. The murmurs began again, louder now, layered and discordant. They weren't words, just the suggestion of words. They sounded sinister but alluring at the same time. My hands trembled, my knuckles white as I gripped the can of bear spray. It took a step forward. The motion was jerky, like a puppet on strings, limbs bending in ways they shouldn't, knees inverted. Water sloshed around its feet, or where feet would be. The legs ended in something blunt and uneven, like roots ripped from the ground. I staggered back, nearly tripping over my pack and tent. The thing didn't stop. It moved with agonizing slowness, but every twitch of its form seemed to test the boundaries of my reality. My breath hitched as I realized the murmurs weren't coming from it. Not entirely. They were echoing from the pipe, from the ground, from the air around me, like a chorus of whispers, closing in, swarming around me like a cloud of moths. I shouted, my voice cracking, and sprayed the bear deterrent in its direction. The fine orange mist filled the entrance to the culvert, and the sound that followed wasn't a shriek of pain, wasn't even remotely human, but it was human language. In a voice deep and husky, the thing commanded, "Go!" The word seemed to surround me, coming from every direction. I whirled, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the open plains and the wind now rising in wicked gusts. When I turned back to the culvert, the figure was gone. The antlers, however, were not. They were closer, now planted just a few feet from where I stood. Their tips gleaming wetly, freshly coated in something thick and dark. My instincts took over. I grabbed my pack, abandoning the sample kit, and sprinted away from the rise, away from the culvert, away from whatever had been inside. The terrain blurred as I ran. My only thought was to put as much distance as possible between me and that thing. I didn't stop until I reached the base of a ridge a few miles away, panting and shaking. Only then did I allow myself to look back. The rise was a speck on the horizon, almost indistinguishable from the rest of the barren landscape. I never filed my reports about the samples. Instead, I requested reassignment and avoided all work involving isolated locations. Months later, I finally allowed myself to read about Western American folklore. Stories of the deer man led me to the Slavic legend of the Leshen. These cropped up again and again. Ancient entities tied to the wilderness, a guardian or a predator, depending on the account. I wouldn't recommend looking up the drawings of these things. It was said to appear to those who had crossed into places they weren't meant to be, dragging them screaming into caves, heavy brush, or perhaps large drainage pipes. If that's what I'd seen, I can't explain why it let me go. Sometimes, late at night, I wake up with a weight on my chest and the faint, beckoning echo of words I don't understand.